Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Erin.
And welcome to Between Two Filing Cabinets, where we bring you tips, trends, troubles, and stories from HR.
That's right.
So we're coming back from the holidays, and we thought it might be important to talk about discipline and coaching and maybe starting the new year off on the right foot.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to be a question that I get a lot either in trainings or people calling in, and I'm sure you have too.
Mm-hmm.
People are wondering, okay, great, we know coaching is good. When does coaching end and discipline begin? Or when does coaching end and more of the formal process begin? And so there's a lot there to unpack.
Sure.
But first and starters, maybe it would be helpful to people like, what are we talking about when we talk about discipline? I think a lot of people put a lot of different things in the discipline bucket.
Yeah, they do. They tend to put like performance issues, conduct issues. Anytime anything's wrong, it seems like it gets put in that disciplinary bucket. But I think there really is different things when you're talking about sort of a disciplinary action versus something that warrants coaching, performance management type of response. Typically, discipline is going to be where there's been a violation of some sort of policy or code of conduct.
Okay.
Someone has an attendance problem. They have a safety issue. Those sorts of things. So it's not necessarily a quality of work or a quantity of work. It's that there is a practice or policy or procedure that has been violated.
Okay.
And so that's typically going to warrant, I think, a bit of a different conversation than maybe what you have with the coaching conversation. Typically, that disciplinary conversation is going to be more focused on what that specific gap is, that violation is, what didn't happen or what did happen that shouldn't have happened.
Right.
And you usually have typically some sort of policy or document to refer to, say like, hey, this is what that was expected in terms of your attendance or your safety performance, and this what didn't happen. You still go through an explorative process to understand, why are we having this conversation?
Sure.
Right? Why did this happen in the first place? Because even if it's a disciplinary issue, if we don't get to the root of the problem and we just kind of put a Band-Aid on it and go, don't do that again, and the person says, well, now I know better, I'm not going to make that mistake again. Well, guess what? It's going to happen again. You're going to have the same problem on, 2 months, 2 weeks. We don't know when. And so you still have to go through that explorative process. But I think the tone is typically different with discipline.
Yeah, it sounds like with discipline, there's automatically a level of formality
Right.
that's in place.
Yeah.
You go kind of straight to that procedure because it's already in place to handle situations like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
So at what point does something, kind of talking in that formal, informal, at what point does something escalate to the point of a formal process begin,
Right.
like a performance improvement plan?
Yeah.
At what point, what are your guidelines there?
Yeah, typically what I say is that when there are going to be, or you're expecting that there are going to be consequences, if that conduct happens again, or if it continues to happen, you don't see the change, that's when I say you need to start documenting that so that you can put the person on notice. I mean, that's really what disciplinary, sort of that process is to put the person on notice that they're not meeting the standards of conduct or standard of behavior that you expect for that position or for the company. Put them on notice, give them an opportunity to improve. And obviously not all situations warrant that. Sometimes there's no progressive process. This is an extreme violation and there's not any second chances.
Right.
But that documentation usually then gives a clear guide of saying, this is what's happening, this is what we expect, and here are the potential consequences if we don't see this change, if we don't see that improvement. And so sometimes you might have sort of that, before it becomes a disciplinary issue, maybe that person's still training, or we have a conversation, we figure out like, hey, this really doesn't warrant discipline. Yes, a mistake happened, but because of these factors, they weren't trained properly, or there were just other mitigating factors that we're not going to go through a disciplinary process. Maybe it is more of a coaching issue, retraining or something like that. But yeah, once there's going to be some consequences is when you want to have that more formal, documented process.
Right. So when you anticipate it, or when you kind of suspect, or when you know that there might be consequences, start taking that formal process.
Yeah. So when do you think, because there is that difference between coaching and discipline. So when do you think coaching is warranted versus discipline, and does coaching ever really end?
That's a really good question. I think that, that's implied by the very nature of the question. Like, oh, when does coaching end? Well, it doesn't. Right? Coaching is not going to end. I mean, if you think about it, coaching is really caring about the other person's professional development or their experience in the workplace. It's just caring.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you think about it, we talk about this in our trainings a lot at Leadership Engagement Essentials. Like, there's 3 sources of power that you have as a supervisor or leader. One of them is your authority, the nature of your position, right? Because I said so.
Yeah.
Right? The second one would be your knowledge,
yeah.
Right? Your industry knowledge, your experience. The third one is your relationship power, right? And that's essentially what coaching is. It's you're leveraging your relationship power with that person. You have trust established with that person. That person knows that you mean well, and you have an eye out for their development. So hopefully that's not going to go away, regardless of what level you're at. I mean, yeah, you might have to kick something into gear, right, and have to explore consequences, right? But it's not like coaching stops. And I think a lot of times people confuse coaching with cheerleading and this idea that coaching is just the happy stuff, and it's not. You can be very firm with someone about your expectations and still be kind in the process. And what I often recommend too is you should maybe be documenting some of that too for your own sake, regardless of whether or not you anticipate there being consequences of it. I forget, so I want to remind myself of what I've talked about or when I have, so I can have my own notes. It's also doing somebody else a favor if you send them an email afterwards saying, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this. I just wanted to kind of review what we did talk about so that there's no misunderstandings, or if there's anything that's left unclear, we can talk about it. And that's actually really helpful for the other person, especially if they're not anticipating kind of like some feedback on a point, then they might feel a little bit caught off guard. So it's a good opportunity to be like, oh, actually, I didn't know that we had talked about bullet point number 3. Can we go back to that for a second?
Yeah, it's such a great tip to do, and it doesn't seem as formal as maybe some of the other ways, but it's because so much gets lost in translation of like, well, I thought I heard this, and you think you heard something else, and then we see it in writing, and we go, oops, that's not really what I agreed to. So it's such a great way to make sure that you're both on the same page after the conversation. Yeah. And
it lends itself too for when it does potentially become more like of a formal process, because a lot of times, it's more of like we know from 2020 hindsight vision, like, oh, there are going to be consequences now. I didn't see that coming until after the conversation, right? Or after we already talked about it once or twice. And so it can kind of make it a little bit easier when you do need to kind of to swing it out.
So with coaching, when does coaching ever lead to discipline, or does it?
When does coaching ever lead? Like, so I think that it's part of discipline. Sometimes it doesn't ever stop. Yeah, because I think with a coaching, again, it gets kind of put in that disciplinary bucket, and I think there's a difference, because maybe sometimes people interpret the consequences of coaching of like, hey, we've gone through this process and we've supported you and we've tried to give you all of the tools that you need to succeed, but you're still not doing it. Yeah.
So they might think of those consequences as discipline, but I don't necessarily think that's discipline. In terms of, there hasn't been necessarily a violation of a code or a code of conduct or those sorts of things. They're just still not meeting performance expectations.
Absolutely, they're not meeting performance expectations. But that's the nature. That's the nature of the job, right? And so either they are able to fulfill the duties of their job description, or they're not. Right. And that can be really difficult, because sometimes that might not be something quite as egregious as that would warrant a more formal.
Right, and then the formal side of things is different than discipline too, right? So with a disciplinary notice, it's again, that tone is different. It's kind of like, here's what happened, here's that gap, here's the policy that was violated, or whatever it was that was violated, and here's what we expect, and here's the consequences. It's a little bit more kind of rigid. There's not necessarily always that room for as much what we would say is coaching, whereas coaching, sometimes it can still result in a formal process, like a performance improvement plan, but it's not the same as that formal disciplinary process,
and like you were saying earlier, it's really important to still have some of those elements of like, we still want to know why it's happening, right? No, there's no flexibility. There's no flexibility at all, that this is the standard and then we must keep that. and still can ask questions as to like, well, why did this happen in the first place, or what was the thinking going
Right.
on here? That's kind of a coaching kind of approach,
Right.
right? But you're still doing it
Right.
and having the effect, and
Yeah.
you're still maintaining the discipline.
Yeah. A lot of times when I work with people in HR, I say what the process when you get to the formal part in terms of the steps and what the information you're after is the same.
Yeah.
Whether it's discipline or performance management, right? We want to identify the problem.
Right.
We want to explore why the problem is happening.
Mm-hmm.
We want to state where that gap is in performance. We want to explore solutions,
Mm-hmm.
and then we want to talk about, what we can both do to improve. We want to put a plan, like, hey, and sometimes with discipline there isn't a plan. Then we write it up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so the process from a technical standpoint is the same whether you're dealing with discipline or performance,
Yeah.
and what you're trying to capture. And ultimately the result could be the same. You don't meet that, you could lose your job or not have as many responsibilities, or those sorts of things. But I think in terms of the overall tone and content,
Yes.
is very different.
Absolutely. And frankly, I mean, I feel like even if it comes down to termination
Yeah.
with somebody, there is a way that you can still leverage your coaching communication style.
Yeah.
There's still a way that you can try to communicate from that relationship power,
Yeah.
even though you're by nature exercising or flexing your authority power.
Right, for sure.
But there's no reason why it still can't be it can't be kind
Right.
at
Yeah.
the same time.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a common misconception, is that to be coaching is weak, or to be you're not being firm, or it's not real, it's too light.
Right.
And it's not. You can
Right.
be extremely firm. You can hold a boundary very solidly,
Right.
and be kind in the process.
Right, yeah. And I think people come to respect that if they understand that you have their best interest in mind, and they're willing to support them. It's not just all on them.
Right.
That that's the role of the coach. Like, how can I help you?
Mm-hmm.
Right? But yeah, there are things that you need to do as well. But I'm willing to guide you and do what it takes.
Yeah.
You've got to be willing to do your part.
It's a respect
well.
thing, you know. It's like I can still I can still respect you as a person, even if
Right.
this isn't a good fit,
Right.
right? Or this
Right.
isn't working out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think those are some good tips on coaching and discipline.
And discipline, yeah.
So we'll file it under that, coaching and discipline.
Sounds
and
good to me.
We will see you next time.
Thanks.